Hello again, and welcome to another section of video notes for Clause 2. This section corresponds with our second unit about the reliability of the Bible. We're still asking the question, why does it matter whether the Bible is accurate or not? This video is prepared to correspond with Interact 231, 2.3.1, and the handout that you should have looks like this. Let's talk about what we should learn in this lesson. Our interact is entitled Ancient Forgeries or Reliable Histories. Based on that, I'm sure you can guess that we will be discussing how we can know that the Bible is an accurate document. The last time we talked, we discussed why it even matters that it's accurate, and this time we're going to ask the question, how do we know that what we have is what we're supposed to have? By the end of this session, you should be able to answer the following questions. First of all, what two extra biblical sources are important to the reliability of the Old Testament? Why was it important that Moses knew how to write? Why is written history more reliable than oral tradition? What steps were taken to ensure the accurate transmission of biblical text? If you have your handout and a writing utensil, we're going to dive in just a minute, but before we do, let's consider an illustration that will help us understand a major concept of this lesson. The telephone game has been a favorite of large groups of small children for forever, perhaps. And I guess even before the telephone was invented, they probably played this game. They probably had to call it something else, but I digress. Do you remember how the game works? One child will begin by telling the next child something, and then they whisper in their ear only one time. That next person has to whisper to the next person, and the next, and so on. And the object is to see if you can get all of the way through the group and come out with the same sentence. Of course, you can hardly ever do this, and it's funny to hear how the original sentence gets twisted by the end. It's almost disappointing when the original sentence stays intact. Do you remember the problems that you encountered along the way? Sometimes someone wasn't clear, or you would think you heard something that you didn't. Perhaps someone with a speech impediment would mess things up. That's usually what happened to me. Was the object to keep the statement the same or to see how much you could mess it up? I don't remember. Anyway, the bottom line is this. When you pass something from one person to the next, to the next, to the next, something usually gets left out, added, or somehow changed. As I said, this is important to our discussion of the accuracy of the Bible. Some people think this is how we got the Bible in the first place. They believe that someone like Abraham told the story to his children who passed it on to the next generation and so on. And the idea of one generation passing the history to the next by telling stories is called oral tradition. And that leads us to Interact 2.3.1. You should take notes as we work through the information. We'll discuss it here and we'll also talk about it in class, but make sure you get this information. First, we want to consider the question, is the Bible written from historical accounts passed along until someone finally decided to write them down? Or are the accounts in Scripture taken from written histories? To answer that question, let's consider the problem with this method. As the telephone game demonstrates, oral tradition can be full of problems. There's no guarantee that what we end up with is anything like the original. If that's the case, then I personally would have problems accepting the historicity, the authenticity, and the authority of the Bible. Wouldn't you? In addition to this, for many years, scholars believed that Moses didn't even know how to write. Moses lived around 1400 to 1250 BC, and they believed that writing was invented long after his lifetime. If that's the case, then it certainly wasn't Moses who wrote the first 5 books of the Old Testament, the Pentateuch. It had to be someone else from a later time period. So now we have 2 strikes against the authority of the Bible, if you're counting. So that's it then. The authorities say it's not reliable. The scholars agree the Bible is rubbish. It's false. Get rid of it. It's no longer an authority in our lives. It's kind of sad. We'll miss the old thing, but oh well, life goes on. Well, before we go too far, let me give you a little bit of information. Around 1974, according to some sources, an archaeological dig near a place called Ebla in Syria discovered hundreds of fragments of clay tablets. Those clay tablets had writing on them and they date back to at least 2500 BC, but could go back as far as 4000 BC. That's anywhere from 1000 to 1500 years before Moses was even born. That's before Abraham was born. Now understand, these tablets of Ebla, as they're called, do not contain any significant information in and of themselves. They don't say anything like, "Thou shalt know that Moses doth know how to write, and hath written the first 5 books of the Old Testament." No, that would just be weird. But what they do is show us two things, maybe even three. First, that writing is older than Moses. Second, that it's more possible that a person, more than possible, that a person educated in Pharaoh's household probably knew how to write. Also, that writing has existed from around the time that God began speaking to people personally, Abraham's time. And fourth, that the scholars and experts are not always right. Basically, the writers, even the oldest one, Moses, had no need to depend on oral tradition to record what he recorded. Now, if you're just keeping count, you know I listed more than 3 or 4 things, and so, you know, I don't know how to count. But the bottom line is that the tablets of Ebla were and are a significant historical find. So back to our question, did the Bible come from oral tradition or written records? The simple answer is no. The solution to the problem is found in the tablets of Ebla. It shows us that Moses was literate and wrote the first 5 books of the Old Testament. Like I said, it's highly unlikely that he would be raised in Pharaoh's household and not learn this skill of writing. The Pentateuch claims to be authored by Moses. You can view the references if you'd like, where Moses is referred to as the author. And it also shows us that when Jesus said Moses wrote the Pentateuch, that he was most likely telling the truth. Again, you can look at the references to see where Jesus said that. So remember our domino analogy from a previous lesson? So far, the dominoes are still standing. But if the Bible is accurate, is it also authoritative? Let's not be so hasty as to just accept the Bible as an authority in our lives just because the tablets at Ebla show us that Moses could write. Let's look at another question. Obviously, we don't have the original copies of Moses' writings, if he did write, which we believe he did. All we have are what are claimed to be copies. We don't even have the copies of Moses' copies. We have copies of the copies of the copies of the copies. How reliable are those? That's an important question. Because if the Bible isn't accurate, then it should not be an authority in our lives. But what if it is? So let's consider the process that the copiers went through when they would copy from one document to the next. The process was very precise and meticulous. We know about this because in 1947, before the tablets of Ebla helped us understand that Moses could write, a Bedouin shepherd was searching among the caves along the shores of the Dead Sea looking for a lost animal. He was throwing rocks into the caves, trying to see if he could startle the animal into making a sound and save him the time of searching in every cave. One rock he threw into a cave caused the sound of a shattering clay pot. He went to investigate and found what we now call the Dead Sea Scrolls. The Dead Sea Scrolls are an ancient collection of scrolls copied from even earlier scrolls of the Old Testament. The scrolls are thought to come from Jesus' time or before. An analysis of those scrolls when compared to manuscripts from later times shows us that what we were using at the time, the much later copies of the copies of the copies, where the most mistakes could be made, were in fact extremely accurate. The only errors that were found were grammatical errors. There were no errors affecting the doctrinal integrity of the copies that we were using at the time. This confirms some important facts that we already knew. When copies of Scripture were made, they had to be exact and detailed reproductions. You can read about the process that they went through in Jeremiah chapter 36. But basically, if a single mistake was made in a section of a scroll, the whole page had to be thrown away. The writing utensils had to be destroyed, and the work on that section had to be started over. They would count letters and words and rows and columns to make sure that nothing was left out or added. It was a very precise practice. The Apostle Paul states in Romans chapter 3, verses 1 and 2, that the major contribution of Judaism, the Jewish religion, was the keeping of God's very words. They were confident that their copies of copies of copies of copies were accurate, and the Dead Sea Scrolls show us that they were in fact very accurate. Now, this is a difficult concept because we're not used to the need for exact copies. In our day, we have digital copies, printers, copy machines, and so on. But not that long ago, just a few hundred years ago, back before the printing press was invented in the 15th century, if you wanted a copy of a book, you had to get someone to make you a handwritten copy. So let's make a little comparison between the Bible and other ancient texts. Copying ancient text is not unique to Scripture. It has been done for major works ever since writing was invented. When it comes to the reliability of other texts, they are considered historically accurate and reliable based on some basic criteria. The non-religious texts are widely accepted, and when Scripture is put through the same test that these non-religious texts are put through, Scripture stands up very well. Here are the factors by which an ancient copy of a copy is considered to be accurate and reliable. First of all, the number of manuscripts from which the copies are taken is considered. The more copies you have to work from and compare, the more likely it is that the finished product is accurate. Next, the quality of the manuscripts available. Old manuscripts tend to fall apart with age, so if you have several that are mostly complete, it limits the guesswork in the completed copy. Another factor is the time period of the copies you have to work with. The closer the copies are to the date of the original writing, the more reliable they are. The table that you have in your text illustrates how this works. Let's just work through it very quickly. Let's compare Homer's Iliad with the New Testament. As you can see, the Iliad it's still a prominent piece of literature studied by Greek literature students today. You can't get through most college level literature classes without at least talking about the Iliad. It's still considered reliable. The New Testament is questioned by many as a reliable source of information. Let's compare the information. The Iliad, we know, was written somewhere around 900 BC. That's nearly 3,000 years ago. The New Testament was written less than 2,000 years ago. It's quite a bit younger than the Iliad. The oldest copy, the original manuscript doesn't survive of either one of these, but the oldest surviving copy of the Iliad is nearly 2,500 years old. The oldest surviving copy of the New Testament is less than 2,000 years old. So it's much closer to the original writing, and we can see that here. Nearly 500 years passed between the writing of the original and the most recent copy. And yet for the New Testament, only 35 to 85 years passed between the original time it was written and the oldest copy that we have to work from. So based on this criteria alone, which copies are considered to be more accurate? One more factor comes into play here. It's the factor of extant copies, or the number of copies available to work from. They're not all from the same source, and so by comparing them, it helps us check for errors in one copy to the next. There are only 643 extant copies of the oldest surviving copy of the Iliad. But when it comes to the New Testament, there are nearly over 15,000 extant copies that we can compare to find errors. And what that tells us is that the New Testament should be considered a very reliable copy. The copies that we have should be considered very reliable to the original writing. And yet today, many people widely accept the copies of the Iliad that we have, and we question New Testament. All I'm saying is that that is a double standard. Here's another example. Moses wrote the Pentateuch around 1400 BC, somewhere between 1500 to 1200 BC. The oldest copy we have is somewhere around AD 1000. That means that there's less than 2200 to 2500 years between the copy that we have and the writing that Moses did. The extant copies that we have, who knows? But the Dead Sea Scrolls show us now that we have the oldest copy was written in 200 BC. It shrinks the time between the copy and the original to just 1200 years, and we don't really know the number of extant copies. The point here is simply that the Pentateuch still stands that test of literature authenticity. A lot of questions about this. We'll take more later.